You're listening to the Eurofort Radio Network, and this is the Andrew Carrington Hitchcock Show with your host, Andrew Carrington Hitchcock.
Hello everybody, and I'm delighted today to be joined by a returning guest. He was a new guest not that long ago. His name is Jimmie Moglia, and I'm going to bring him up right now. Jimmie, are you with me?
Yes, I am, and good afternoon to you. Good morning to here in the United States, West Coast. Good morning.
Excellent. Well, thank you for joining me early your time. I really appreciate it, and your last show was very well received. But before we get into the title of today's show, which, folks, is called The Secret Relationship Between Jesuits and Jews, I'd like you to let the listeners know about how they can find your work, your website, and also I understand that you've got a special offer available for listeners to this show.
Yes, my website is yourdailysshakespeare.com, and as the title, as the name of the domain implies, the site is connected with my first, between quotes, my first book, which is actually a dictionary inspired by Dr. Johnson, but the dictionary is Your Daily Shakespeare, an arsenal of verbal weapons to drive your friends into action and your enemies into despair. And it is a very unusual, useful, and unique dictionary, and if you can look around, there is nothing like that. And I did it out of passion, not in search of glory or recognition. But the dictionary makes it very easy, and the information on the site is quite abundant, so you can find it. But the dictionary makes it very easy to locate the accurate quotation for any situation that one could possibly find in the course of his life, therefore daily life, and therefore hence your daily Shakespeare. Now, the problem I have, I'm glad to say, in my very small world, the dictionary has been very well accepted. In fact, I had occasion to send one not long ago even to Mongolia, and I suspect that he went to Mongolia because one of the ambassadors somewhere here in the West had translated Shakespeare into Mongolians, which must be an enterprise by itself. Anyway, the book is almost 4 pounds in weight. It is 1,400 pages almost. So it is heavy, and the post office has removed the media mail, which made it very convenient. So the cost of the book to send out is about $40, including the packaging in very complex forms and everything else. It's $36, almost $37 plus $3 for the packing and so forth. But I would like people to have the book because I said it's not an operation. So if anyone wants to have the book and mentions it to me, I would give them the book for $10, of which $5 go to the cat shelter because I'm a feline lover and I want to help them. But so it's not. But just send an email to me if you wish to receive the book, and I will reply to you. Give me some time because even packing it individually is a bit of an operation. But I will make sure that I can send you the book, and I hope you will enjoy it.
And your email again?
Jimmie, as opposed to Jimmy. It's on the website. So if you go to the website, you will find the information on the first page, on the home page, and you can email me and let me know what you wish me to do.
Excellent. And that, of course, folks, is yourdailysshakespeare.com. So take advantage of this offer of this unique book, and make sure when you email Jimmie to say that you heard it on this show to qualify for this very special offer. Now, the title of today's show, The Secret Relationship Between Jesuits and Jews. And I know Jimmie's been doing a lot of work on this. So where do you want to start us off in a timeline? What year are we looking at that you've identified some goings-on between these two groups that we're told historically are so opposed to one another?
Sure. Whenever we talk about history, it's always prudent and wise to say, in my view. However, in this, the first information is everybody agrees with it. The history precedes the history of the involvement of the parallels, rather, between the Jews and the Jesuits starts before the Jesuit foundation the Jesuits were born as an order. And it starts in the 1300, at the end of the 1300, when the kingdom of Spain, the two kingdoms of Spain, which at the time they were not yet united, Aragon and Castile, there were others too, when the decision was made to expel the Jews. And this was certainly not the first time and not the last time where this particular sect incurred into this event. But the Jews were given an option either to convert or to leave the country. Now, not everybody could, not every Israelite could leave the country, so the majority actually converted. And of the majority, I think it's difficult to establish statistics, but the majority of those who converted to Christianity were also involved already quite heavily, both in the machine of state and the bureaucracy, as we would call it today, and various other functions, including notably one for which this particular sect was famous for, that of tax farming. So what happened, apparently, according to the records, was that many these people were called either conversos, which is the Spanish for converted, very easy, or marranos, which was a term that also covered those Muslims who had converted to Christianity themselves. However, notably for the Jews, many of the conversos either kept or retained their crypto religion or crypto Jewishness, or perhaps from the practical point of view worse or whatever, more noticeable, was the fact that they maintained their mode of operation and maintained their status and titles, which caused, in a sense, even more resentment than they had caused before they converted. So the situation got to the point 100 years later, because in the Middle Ages things didn't happen overnight. 100 years later, eventually, the King Ferdinand and Queen Isabel, together apparently they had joined the two, Castile and Aragon, but they had an edict, I think it was in 1491, or maybe off they were a year or two, to ban completely the Jews from Spain. It was not an easy operation, and but at the same time, they were already banned. But what they said, they instituted what was called the Inquisition, the office of the Inquisition, and this office was intended to examine in detail whether the converted Jews were actually bona fide converted, was a true conversion, or just a show in order to maintain their status and position. Now, there is a lot of literature and information, both factual, based on documents, and both anecdotal, regarding the persecution that the Jews suffered in the course of the Inquisition. And there were, of course, even then at the time, not everybody is always of the same idea. At the time, there were those who said, no, we shouldn't do this, and others said, yes, we should do it because of, etc., etc. Anyway, this is the background that led eventually to that leads us, rather historical time-wise, to the establishment of the Jesuit orders in the 1530s by Ignatius of Loyola. Now, Ignatius himself, he was he came from a conversos or a converso family, and so were, I think, 5 out of the 6 initial pupils or associates with whom he began the order. Now, because the actual history would be quite long in detail, but one of the main theme of the order, the main objectives of the order, was to exit from the somewhat let's say theoretical, or at least inside view of the church as far as activity and proselytizing was concerned, and translate in this zeal for Christianity on the outside, particularly being very active in not only proselytizing, but in bringing forward the main tenets, the main points of the church. And this, of course, brought them in contact or in direct contact with the major authority of the time, particularly kings, queens, and governments. Now, how to do this in itself sounds very obvious, so it doesn't require much. But one of the particular points that, in my opinion, and not only in my opinion, allows us to establish parallels between the Jesuits and the Israelites was their education and was their system, starting from Loyola himself. He had what he said one of the statements he said Loyola said, we must help others to find peace and direction in their lives out of the inspiration of the Gospels, which in itself sounds a very neutral statement, but it translated into a very detailed syllabus as an education system, which was started by himself. He had a kind of Excel before Excel was invented, a system in order to put down in his diary during the day all the moods that he was going on, the temptations that he had, what was his reaction. So he had a simplified code, in which in each one of the cells of this Excel spreadsheet had his psychological description of how he felt. I mentioned this as an anecdote, but it was a symptom and a representation of how detailed and accurate was the education system they established. We could almost say that Ignatius of Loyola was the father of time management, but instead of being time management dedicated to corporate objectives, what we could say it was dedicated to personal metaphysical development. And so in this sense, the parallel that can be drawn, or the not so secret relationship, was the extreme care given to details. I could go perhaps a little bit later in some few more of the rules that the new Jesuits were required to follow in order to qualify. But the main point being that the education was very strict, was very structured, and above all, it forced the pupil, the new Jesuit, or the soon to be Jesuit, to follow in a almost I would say, I cannot find the adjective in a forced way, to follow the instructions of the teachers without any deviations. In fact, at one point it was said that the pupil or the new Jesuit follows the leaders as if he were a cadaver, which is their actual parallel to say it was a cadaver that has no will of his own, but he must follow very accurately, without any deviation, the thought of his masters. Now, in fact, I was trying to find here as I was talking to you the actual statement. Here I found it.
Before you jump in, Jimmie, I just thought, because this is very important, because while I've been listening to you, I wanted to look up Ignatius Loyola, or Ignatius of Loyola, on the Wikipedia. And as you've said, he was a converso. But interestingly, if you look at the his Wikipedia page, Saint Ignatius of Loyola was a Spanish Basque priest and theologian who founded the religious order called the Society of Jesus Jesuits and became its first superior general. So there's nothing there about Jewish origins, folks. And then you go down to early life. He was born in Aspatia in Basque country, Spain, and it goes on. And again, no mention of his Jewish origins. And then you go down to religious conversion. And it says, while recovering from surgery, he underwent a spiritual conversion, which led to his experience a call to religious life. And it goes on to say he came to read a series of religious texts on the life of Jesus and the life of the saints. It doesn't tell you what he converted from. It just said his religious conversion. So I'm just sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to throw that in because it's very important, because it goes to show how the mainstream are trying to rewrite history and anything that can point negatively to Jews. And it reminds me of years ago when I used to listen to Darrell Bradford Smith, and there were people, they're not coming out anymore, but there were people out there talking about the Jesuits, and then they would talk about the Zionists, and I think that it was obviously these Jews that what they were trying to do back then was they were trying to say, oh, it's not, it's not all Jews, there's this group here called the Jesuits, and there's this group here called the Zionists, and fortunately now that nonsense seems to have drifted away, and people are focusing on the community as a whole. And if all you need to do is to look at what they don't do, they're not jumping around complaining about hate speech laws, they're actively promoting them. They're not jumping around getting Amnesty International to investigate the cases of people like Monica Schaefer, who's being held without trial in a German prison for apology she made to her mother about the Holocaust. And this is the key thing here, and I just wanted to throw it in. I'm not deflecting from your topic, but it's so important for the audience to realise that these subgroups have been manipulated in the past, and as soon as we overcame that in the same way that we overcame the nebulous New World Order and Illuminati, that's when all the shutdowns started on the YouTube and Google and everything else. So please can you continue now, Jimmie?
Yes, well, I would like to attach or to follow what you said with a very personal spirit I had last week, because I had for a professional reason, I became in contact with a young girl married from Peru here in the United States, and she is studying to become an accountant. So I asked her what was she studying at the moment. The first thing that she said, I'm studying about the Holocaust, which has very little to do with accounting, but it brought me to the idea, it brought me back to the thought that this coverage of issues that have to do with the Israelite culture is so extensive and so concentrated that infiltrates itself even to the last ganglia, so to speak, of society. This was also an anecdote, but I don't ask many people what they're studying now. And the first one I asked her says, I'm studying about the Holocaust while really trying to become an accountant. So I'm just reinforcing, if I may, what you said about the infiltration, the total infiltration of the, let's call it the Zionist culture or phenomenon into all aspects of daily life almost. Anyway, I was trying to, one of the original items of the rules was the inferior is as a cadaver in the hands of his superior. However, one of the next leader of the order, we're talking about the 1500, end of 1500, said, all should be of the opinion that whoever is a subject to obedience should permit himself to be governed and directed by Almighty Providence in the person of his superior, just as if you were a body that permits itself to be carried about here and there and then put down into the ground and set down. So the point being, as I mentioned before, this extreme adherence to whatever one is commanded to do without any question. And this reflects, I say, as far as parallel between, let's call it, Jewish culture, my opinion is reflected in some of the extraordinary statements that some of the rabbis make quite openly, even recently in Israel, but also in other places, in the United States. I'm referring to the statement of the famous rabbi who was honored in death by a huge funeral, who said that that goyims are made to be the servants of the Jews, and a statement like that, if we were to make it by a goyim, would probably not have got him into jail, if not for life, for saying something absolutely unacceptable, and people go to jail for very little. But if I may interject another point to do, which I think is not relevant to the Jews, but is relevant to the issue. As you, just slightly changing subject, as you know, last week or the week before, Billy Graham died, and Billy Graham was the most famous preacher. Everybody knows about him. And maybe many of your audience know or have heard the recorded conversation that he had with Richard Nixon about the power of the Jews on the media, and the famous statement that he made, saying that if we do not control, or rather put a break to the power of the Jews in the media, this country is going to go down the toilet. And would you agree? And Nixon said, yes, I agree, but I could never say it. At which, and this is the point where the recording becomes a little bit fuzzy, but anyway, if you follow it, what then Billy Graham says, what would be necessary is a person in high places that would stand out, had the courage to stand out and say it, denounce it, and start the process by which there would be a little bit less control of Jewish control on the media. At which point one would be tempted to say, but you are the very person, with all your fame, fortune, and popularity, you are the very person who should have started this. Instead, Billy Graham was actually very fervent outside. As a Zionist, he went to Israel quite often, and he was part of the so-called neo-evangelical, or the sect of the evangelicals, who believe in the book of Revelation and the Armageddon and the Antichrist that will come when all the Jews will be in Israel, and something which is even, I mean to say that Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is a more realistic rendition of reality than the evangelical revelation, the Armageddon, the rapture, and things. But I mention this in the context of our conversation, not because it applies, but because it outlines some of the difficulties that exist for those who would like to have a little bit more balanced influence, yes, on the major purveyor and period of the news, and which we are essentially helpless. It is very good that we can have the occasion, as you said, of the show and many other shows, but at the same time, all of us are subject to to the real danger of being, cut out, which is almost is a kind of inquisition in reverse. But anyway, as I was saying, going back to the business of the Jesuits, and that we could go for a long time. The Jesuit order very gradually and quickly, partly because of their zeal, and they were very, very, very active. They, particularly in the South American colonies, they were very strong, and what they did was not entirely bad. They almost set up some kind of communes of the autochtones, of the aborigines, if you like, who were otherwise sometimes be quite brutally exploited by the so-called conquistadores. And so they, all over the world, where they went to China, they went to India, they went to Japan, sometimes with mixed success, but they really put themselves into activity of proselytization, evangelization. And especially in Europe, they became quickly, we can say quickly, but gradually, but steadily, they became the confessors of the high and mighty, particularly kings, queens, and sometimes their lovers too, of the lovers of the king, because all the kings had at the time, even now, they had lovers, whatever. And then they acquired some. There were some events that caused the first the reduction of power of the Jesuits, and then their expulsions from various states in Europe. One of the traits that we could establish a parallel from between Jesuits theory and Jewish practice was I'll mention one, extractly, because we could really speak for hours, was a technique of, it was called the technique of equivocation. And the actual term is a term which is a Greek term because amphibolia, but in more terms it means equivocation, which means it turning a double meaning or an ambiguity to one's own advantage. And in modern times, a clear example of equivocation, if you want to see an example, was Clinton, when he said that he had never sex with that woman. That was equivocation because he could interpret sex in the way that it was suitable to him. And as I mentioned, they became the favorite confessors, particularly for another reason, that they had a strange theory which would take would have to do quite a bit of reading in order to even describe it, and even then it would be difficult to interpret because some of their writings are such you can read it in both ways, so everybody is right. And one was they were quite lenient with the sinners based on the technique of the adaptation of theory to practice. For example, I'll give you an example. One of the bigwigs in the Jesuit field wrote a book called The Universal Moral Theology, where he says that for merchants, the giving of a short weight of a good is not to be recorded as a sin when the official price for certain goods is so low that the merchant would be ruined if the measurement of the goods, if the scale were accurate. In other words, it is okay for a merchant to trick the customer with the wrong weight of the scale, because otherwise he would not be able to operate or go into bankruptcy. I'm quoting two examples as a certain mode of operation, which somewhat parallels what happens almost daily with the Jews when they completely disregard one piece of information and brought out another one that that helps them to make their point. Other things that I'm reading, this one I read because it's a little bit not long but enough better to quote it, as some of the maxims that they were taught in school. What brings you credit, look it to yourself. What brings you discredit, look to another to do it in your stead. Make another one take the fall for you. Embark on another man's business to save yourself from thinking of your own. Trust, this is very important, trust your friends of today as if they were your enemies of tomorrow. And know how to sweeten your refusal and learn to find the right thumbscrew so that no man can refuse what you ask for. Keep your eyes fixed on the happy outcome, since victor never needs to excuse himself anymore, which is really almost a very Machiavellian rule of life, if you like. Now, the first cracks, in Jesuit power occurred at the dawn of the Enlightenment, which the Enlightenment is associated with the 1700s. But the first cracks, as I said, happened with Cardinal Richelieu, the famous Cardinal of France, who at the time when he an anecdote. When he was on his bed, he was asked by his confessor to forgive his enemies, and he said, I've no enemies but the enemies of France. And he considered to be the Jesuits to be the enemies of France. And again, we can see here, if we want to try to this like Plutarch, the parallel lives of Plutarch, if you want to try the parallel lives of mode of operation of sects, if you like. The Jesuits, as I mentioned before, had been so successful in manipulating kings and queens, and so that the kings and the queens found themselves to be essentially pawns in the hand of whatever this particular sect, the Jesuits, wanted to achieve. Things got a little bit worse with Louis XIV, the king's son. This was happened I have made a note here, in 1685, when a Jesuit court chaplain delivered a sermon that was interpreted as a denunciation of the king's lover, Madame de Montespan. As you know, in French history, there were various lovers who grew to prominence due both perhaps to the fact that they being lovers of the king, but also because of their sometimes intellectual standing. And this was the Jesuit king's confessor was very much against both the first lover of the king, Madame de Montespan, with whom he gave away after following the Jesuit advice, but the next lover, Madame de Maintenon, again, for those who follow French history, is a fairly known name. He also went against her, and then at this point, these lovers began to put up some resistance. But the real problem in France, at least, came with Louis XV, whose lover is almost known by many people, by almost everyone, whose lover was Madame de Pompadour. And now it was not. This is not an apology for the French court, where there were sort of excesses, almost similar to Hollywood's today. But one of the Jesuit confessor was very much an enemy of Madame de Pompadour, who tried to ingratiate herself with him but didn't succeed. In one case, the Jesuit confessor succeeded in persuading the king to build a special staircase, that was a secret staircase that would connect his bedroom with the bedroom of the lover. So it gives you an idea of the excesses. Which reminds me. I hope I'm not going too off the theme. That is a bit of hypocrisy there, because the actual Pope that sanctioned the establishment of the Jesuits was Pope Paul III Farnese. He belonged to the family of Farnese. And nobody far from Rome, in Central Italy, a beautiful place, there is a town called by the name of Caprarola. People may want to look them in the internet. Is Caprarola. And the palace of the Pope looks like a small pentagon. It's just made like a pentagon. And I went to see it. It's very beautiful. And the beautiful gardens around it. And in this particular palace of Pope Paul III, there's a very interesting staircase, a helicoidal staircase that was used by the Pope allegedly. We always have to say this, allegedly used by the Pope to introduce and let go out his lovers. So on the one hand, in Rome, what to do in Rome, what do the Romans do? You remember the proverb maybe doesn't apply literally, but the same standards that were required of the King of France were not certainly applied to the Pope in Italy. Well, which reminds me of something I didn't say at the beginning. The first area of where the Jesuits became very important in their action was of course the Council of Trent, the Counter-Reformation. They were really the kings of the Counter-Reformation and all that happened afterwards. So that should be also mentioned. How we can say another place where we had very important presence was, of course, the gunpowder plot in England with James I. We could go into that detail, but we will fill the show an hour with an amount of detail. But all this goes to show that in general, the power that the Jesuit as an order had very quickly gained, as I mentioned before, throughout all the courts of Europe, to the point where they felt entitled to actually organize the explosion of the House of Parliament with the king in it. It didn't succeed, but I can see a parallel here, if I may. Somebody may disagree, but I can see a parallel with the wars in the Middle East, because the wars, in particular in Iraq and Libya, let alone Syria, were wars clearly only declared on behalf of Israel. And the one in Iraq particularly is very painful for me to remember, painful so to speak, but I really feel bad, because in my earlier days as a corporate man employed in a company, I was working in Iraq. It was my area of responsibility, so I opened an office. And to me, it was the most advanced country in the Middle East. They had a universal health care. You could go to, it was very safe. You could go walk at night all over Baghdad, which is, and all that place. Very safe, no problem. Of course, it was not a rich country, but the culture and everything else, we go into a long conversation. So, but it was among the Arab countries that they met, was the most well run. And so to see it destroyed in the way it was is something that should be a painful recollection and an experience for all mankind. Anyway, let's go to the. How far are we?
Well, we've got about just under 20 minutes left, but all these different Jesuit orders, as you say, they expanded throughout Europe and what have you. Have you got evidence that a great deal of these Jesuits were actually still racially Jewish, or were there still actual genuine Christians, white race Christians, if you like, that were joining them and obtaining positions of power amongst them?
I've not been able to find actual evidence, but before, and I should have mentioned this before when talking about the beginning, there was a conflict inside the order between those who wanted to exclude any Jesuit from becoming, any converso from becoming one, if in the previous 5 generations there had been a Jew. But then things changed, and in a way that this was disregarded. So I don't have any evidence or know of people who have conducted researches whether the following Jesuits who became Jesuits had records of previous having belonged to a Jewish family. What is, in my opinion, important, however, is that their strict discipline, the mode of operation in terms of establishing themselves at the various courts in Europe, as well as their proselytizing activity in the colonies in South America, was very similar to what the Jewish organizations do today everywhere. There are literally thousands of Jewish centers throughout the United States. And this in itself would not be a bad thing, because they take care of themselves. But it is totally disproportionate to the effort at connecting Christians or Catholics The Catholics have essentially lost the battle a long time ago with respect to evangelization and things like this. Also because the Catholics still maintain themselves more on the spiritual side, whereas the Jews maintain themselves. They use the religion in order to establish themselves materially, so to speak, as we all know. And of the 48% of the billionaires in the United States, according to statistics, are Jews, which tells you something when you have a very small percentage of population as such. So it's a very, very low, very well represented in the realms of wealth. So the answer is no. I don't have any evidence, but the evidence in this case, I think, is not so much, in my view anyway, is not as important as the beginning was. And what was important, it was the method of capillary expansion of the Jesuit power, is similar to what the Zionists, the Jews, have done throughout the West, and particularly notably in the United States. So I hope I've answered your question.
Yes, absolutely. That's very well put. And this is the point, folks. I mean, it's amazing how this, but when the Jesuits were founded, of course, Ignatius of Loyola, we know, was a Jew. We know that the Wikipedia page on him doesn't reveal his Jewish ancestry whatsoever, so why are they trying to hide it? But also I understand that, wasn't there 7 Jesuits who kind of founded it, and 5 of them were Jews? Is that correct?
Yes, I think I mentioned at the beginning, but probably I tend to put many things together. Yes, out of 5 of those were Jews. Yes, I don't remember now whether 6 or 7, but anyway, one only was not a converso. The other one were all conversos. Yes, they're all marranos.
Exactly. And did you want to jump in, because we were talking before the show, folks, and you were going to mention Tony Martin at some point if you had the opportunity. Yes. Do you want to jump into that now and then?
Now we're talking. Let me finish, because I will jump, because otherwise we would have 2 hours and annoy your viewers, your listeners. But the first one, when the first crash of the Jewish power happened in Portugal, where this was due to internal things that I will not go into it. But anyway, the prime minister at one point became so annoyed with them and says he sent, it's anecdotal, is interesting. He sent to all his commissioners, or rather the authorities in the realm, 2 envelopes to open only on the dawn of a certain day, which is in April, on the pain of death if they opened before. And what this instruction said, all the Jews must be arrested, put on ships, and sent to Rome, all their properties confiscated, and so forth, which happened. However, as an irony, and it's an anecdote, but it's also ironical. This poor Jesuits was put on these galleons all the time, was not very easy traveling. When they arrived in front of the city of Civitavecchia in Rome, the Pope was Clement, I don't remember the name, but the number was Clement something. He said, no, we cannot accept them. And he didn't accept them because he didn't want to upset some other countries where they had problems with the Jews. So these poor Jews from Portugal were eventually disembarked in Corsica after several months. Many died during the trips, I think about 3,000. So it tells you how contorted was the history. Then we had the case of France next, and finally we had the case of Spain, and then the part of the general expulsion of the Jesuits from the various countries was due to the fact that many of the reigning families, except England, were the Bourbons, and they were kings and queens everywhere. So it almost was a domino effect. Once they were expelled from a country, they went into another. Also, the other one expelled them, so forth. Yes, where there were exceptions. For example, the exception was Frederick the Great, that liked to keep them because of their ability in training, and also amazingly Catherine the Great in Russia kept them there for quite a long time. Before we get to Tony Martin, that I would like to mention about, I think we should mention the somewhat contorted relationship between the Jesuits and the Vatican in recent times, at least in the last 100 years and even now. One of the most amusing part is in my opinion, amusing, at least anecdotally amusing, was the influence of the Jesuits in the second part of the 1900s, connected with both the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, which refers to the mother of the Virgin Mary, and the infallibility of the Pope. As you know, the Pope there was a dogma which was issued in the second part of the 19th century, where it declared that whatever the Pope says when he speaks ex cathedra, when he speaks from the chair, is infallible. Nobody can question it. And of course, many of the cardinals were against this, so it was a very contorted decision to come to that. And Pope Pius IX also has a bit of a sense of humor. The more all these cardinals remained in Rome, the more expensive it became for the Vatican to keep them, because the cardinals had a pretty good life. And so at this point, there were two factions among the cardinals. The one that says the Pope is fallible, and the other faction says the Pope is infallible. And the infallible is in Italian translates into the fallible translates as fallibilisti, but it also means to go bankrupt. So the Pope said, if between this fallible and infallible, they will make me go bankrupt if they stay here much longer. So which was eventually, as you know, the faction that favored the infallibility of the Pope prevailed. There were recent cases where they became involved, almost creating very strong splitting tendency inside the church, particularly in Holland, has to do with birth control and liberation theology. The Jesuits were very strong in liberation theology, particularly in South America, which you heard about. And also, they took a stand on birth control, and the solution that they found, at least the Jesuits, for the Catholic who want to practice birth control, very much is reminiscent of their technique of equivocation that we spoke about before. And but I will not go into detail because it would be too long to go into it. So, bottom line, they are still around because they were reinstalled afterwards, and they are still very active in the church. I would say that there are, at the moment, the Catholic Church is in such a state of, I would say, turmoil. I don't know whether you are aware that there are movements, even there is one here in the United States called the Remnant, who are very adverse to the policies of the current Pope Francis, who is a Jesuit, by the way. And so that would require perhaps an hour by itself just to discuss all the tendencies that there are now. And it's essentially a state of confusion. The church doesn't really know what to do. It doesn't know what to do with the transgenders, doesn't know what to do with the homosexuals, or rather it does, but it's not said, and it doesn't, and actually it favors two things. And how much the Jesuits are influencing this, I don't know, and then I will finish. After the Second Vatican Council, Vatican II, a bull was issued regarding the fact that the Jews were no longer held accountable for the death of Christ, which led eventually to popes visiting Israel, particularly this one, and even putting some rabbis into some of the congregations of the Catholic Church, which seems a paradox by itself. But that is what happened. So in the long run, I would say that the Jesuits paralleled in their, if you want to conclude the argument here, unless you have questions, the structure of the Jesuits' work and mode of operation is very similar to what the Zionists, the Jewish power, have done in order to gain this mastery, if you like, in the Western world. And though in itself the way the one must bow in admiration to the skill with which all this was conducted, both by the Jesuits at the height of their fame and by the Jews at the current time.
Yes,
now,
and just quickly, can you just, when you talked about the Jews, was it the Jews being expelled from Portugal, and then they ended up in Corsica after going to Rome, and many of them died? Jesuits, yeah. And what year was that time? From Portugal was at the beginning of the 1700s. Let me see. Yeah, it was 1759 was the first, and the expulsion of the Jesuits, as I mentioned before, occurred in parallel with the prevailing of the Enlightenment ideas and a sort of a wave of atheism that swept through Europe, particularly fostered by people like Voltaire, Diderot, and even Rousseau could not be considered certainly a typical Christian. So, yeah, the main wave of expulsion occurred in the first and particularly second part of the 1700s, and although it started, as I mentioned, with the crack happened in the 1600s with the King's Son, and then Louis XV in the 1700s, and then. Napoleon, of course, had the Pope prisoner, so, yeah. And the other point I wanted to make, isn't it interesting how we start off with this Ignatius Loyola, and we finish off with Pope Francis, who you say is also a Jesuit, but many people regard him to be Jewish anyway. He certainly seems to fit the bill, and with what he's actually, his policies are all in line with theirs, wouldn't you agree?
Yes, except platonically, because his family is from Piedmont, from a region of Piedmont, which is very close to what part of my family has or had a vineyard. They were winemakers in the Piedmont, and so from what it transpires, his ancestors from this particular town near Alessandria were certainly not Jews. They were the farmers, and they went to South America because in the waves of immigration from Europe, people from Piedmont, the northwest, traditionally many of those tend to go to Argentina. I don't remember exactly why, but because it was agricultural and there was opportunity for agriculture in Argentina, so that was the reason. Which doesn't, however, there's actual physical Jewishness and the Jewish mode of thought, and the two things should not be confused, but they have, of course, an influence in how on the mode of operation, we could say. Yeah.
Excellent. We've got a couple of minutes left. You're able to fit in your comments regarding Tony Martin in that time. If you need to overrun a bit longer, then we can overrun a little longer. No,
that's okay. I mentioned this because in recent times, I found that even in the, let's call them progressive in the good way, in the alt-right as we call them, I find that speakers or the presenters have difficulty even to mention the word Israel to mention the word Jews, because they're afraid of being considered an anti-Semitic. As you know, even recently there was a statement made by I don't know which Jewish authority saying that speaking against Israel is by itself an anti-Semitic, and being anti-Semitic is almost equivalent to committing a crime. I'm exaggerating, but the censorship almost suggests it. Anyway, so in that context, you mentioned at the beginning that the theme of the talk today was the secret relationship between Jews and Jesuits, and that brought to mind to me the case of Tony Martin. Among others, Tony Martin was a African American professor at the Wellesley College on the East Coast, and in his course on African American history, he had introduced a book called, as appropriately, The Secret History Between Blacks and Jews. And as you know, in the United States, there are two divergent factions among African Americans or people who concern themselves with African Americans. One is the NAACP, the National Advancement of Colored People, that was founded, I think, at the beginning of the 20th century by Jews. And as you said yourself in one of the shows that I heard about, the first non-Jewish president of the NAACP was an African American in 1970s. So for a long time, and still is, the NAACP has been essentially an organization fostered, maintained, and funded and helped by the Jews. This particular organization, from what I've seen and followed, it is anything except helping the actual African Americans. But the other one is the school that has as a leader Louis Farrakhan. And Louis Farrakhan is the one who he's actually tried to do what he could. The circumstances, it would be a totally different subject. And anyway, one of the results of their activity was the publishing of two very extensive volumes, very interesting to read, The Secret Relationship Between Black and Jews, which was based essentially, at least from what I read, I only read a quarter of the whole thing, is based on actual sources, Jewish sources, so it's not invented. Anyway, it's a controversial book because it shows that the Jews were very active in the slave trade, and they were, etc. It's a lot of statistics. Anyway, Professor Tony Martin, decided to use the book by the Nation of Islam, Louis Farrakhan, in his course, whereupon the Jews in the institution essentially launched a crusade intended to put him out of taking him out of the university. He was so frustrated out of this that he documented the events and documented what happened to him in a little book which I got and read. It's called The Jewish Onslaught. And it's an excellent documentation of the extent to which some of, because call them Zionists, whatever they are, go in order to defeat or remove, and possibly they cannot kill him, but I couldn't say that they would like to kill him, but certainly to destroy the life of anyone who opposes their point of view or their interpretation of history. Tony, I learned relatively recently, he died a few years ago, quite young, and I suspect, although this is purely conjectural, I suspect that the fight that he had to undergo in order to keep his reputation, let alone position, was something that would probably weaken the constitution of even a strong man. But people can find his lectures on the internet on the influence of the Jews in the slave trade, and if they want, they can find this little book. I think it wasn't very expensive. I don't remember how much it was, but it's worth reading because it's essentially a manuscript, a manual, an example, a template of the mode of operation for the destruction of anyone who opposes the Zionist interpretation of history and interpretation of events at large.
Thank you very much, Jimmie, and that's a perfect way to end the show because that's exactly what's going on today. So I want to thank Jimmie so much for joining me today. His website is yourdailyshakespeare.com. Don't forget the offer to get his book. Send Jimmie an email, mention this show, and take advantage of the offer. I want to thank you all for listening. I'll be back with you all tomorrow, and bye for now.
You have been listening to the Andrew Carrington Hitchcock Show on the Eurofolk Radio Network. Andrew's book, The Synagogue of Satan, is now available on his website, andrewcarringtonhitchcock.com, in an updated, expanded, and uncensored edition.